So I recently went through something that still feels too wild to be real. Imagine unpacking boxes in what you thought would finally be your safe haven, only to have your peace shattered by flashing sirens and an angry neighbor pounding on your door like you stolen her crown jewels. That's how my life by the lake began. And the truth hiding underneath it all, that would change everything I thought I knew about this place, and about myself. Was supposed to be simple, a fresh start. 3 months ago, I moved back to my grandfather's old lakeside house, thinking I'd finally found peace after years of noisy rentals and endless city stress. The house had been sitting empty since he passed, and I figured it was time to give life here another chance. My plan was small, almost wholesome. I'd earned a kayak instructor certification during a rough stretch of unemployment, and I wanted to use it. The water had always been my escape, my rhythm. Out there, it was just me, the mist, the glassy surface of the lake, and echoes of my dad teaching me to fish when I was a kid. That first morning, I was unpacking safety gear, lining up bright orange buoys, already picturing the families and kids who could use this water safely. But then, gravel crunched outside, and my driveway filled with the sharp rhythm of footsteps. She introduced herself as Paula Whitman, president of something called the Lake HOA. Clipboard pressed against her chest, smile tight like it was glued there. She said welcome to the community in a tone that carried about as much warmth as a tax audit. Before I could even respond, she shoved a stack of papers at me. Contracts, she said. Mandatory fees. $150 every month, plus a $200 initiation. I remember staring at the numbers, honestly wondering if she was serious. I tried to be polite. I'm not interested in joining an HOA, I said, handing the clipboard back. I told her I hadn't seen any lake maintenance issues that justified that kind of money. I thought the matter was over. But her smile slipped so fast it was like watching a mask fall off. Her back straightened, her voice sharpened into something clipped and scolding. Nobody lives by the lake without joining the HOA, she declared, like she was announcing a law of gravity. And then, her words cut deeper. This is community lake property. You're trespassing every time you step foot near that water. I actually laughed at first, until I realized she was dead serious. And before I could even make sense of it, she dialed 911, on my porch, reporting me for willful trespassing. My lake, my grandfather's land, she called the cops. When Officer Bennett pulled up 20 minutes later, my chest felt hollow. Even when you know you've done nothing wrong, the sound of a patrol car rolling across gravel has a way of making you feel like a criminal. Paula threw herself into her complaint with all the drama of a courtroom TV show, pointing at the water like it was evidence of a heist. I tried explaining calmly, taxes paid, property inherited, but the surreal fog around me made my words feel thin. The officer listened patiently, finally closing his notebook with a snap. This sounds like a civil matter, not a criminal one, he said, his tone firm but tired. Paula's face turned shades of red I didn't think were humanly possible. She puffed up, declared she was closing the dock for 48 hours until I signed her paperwork, then stormed away. The officer just shook his head, probably wishing he'd never been assigned this beat. When the dust settled, I walked down to my dock, staring at the buoys I'd placed in the water only days earlier. They bobbed gently, marking what I thought were my boundaries. But Paula's confidence had unsettled me. Could she be right? Had I misunderstood something? Was this lake really mine, or had my grandfather's records hidden some ugly truth? That night, I dug through dusty boxes in the basement, searching for answers. My grandfather kept everything: yellowed tax returns, crumpled utility bills, notes scrawled on receipts. Hours passed, my hands blackened with dust, until finally, in a manila folder labeled Property Lines, I found it. An old surveyor's document. Legal language, dense and cryptic, but one phrase jumped out: lake surface rights. The words rang in my mind long after I closed the folder. Surface rights. Did that mean what I thought it meant? Did I not just own this land, but the water too? The next morning, Paula returned. Not alone this time. She brought neighbors, papers spread across my porch table, official seals flashing under the sun. She announced with triumphant authority, "This documentation proves our HOA's control of the lake." The confidence in her voice was chilling. She angled the pages just enough for me to glimpse signatures, but never long enough to actually read them. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Fear, yes, but also suspicion. Because sometimes, the louder someone insists on their authority, the more you wonder what they're hiding. What would you do if your neighbor marched onto your porch with an army behind her? Because that's exactly what I woke up to. Paula wasn't alone this time. She had two neighbors flanking her like bodyguards, arms crossed, eyes darting nervously toward the lake. And spread across my porch table were stacks of papers that looked official enough to silence anyone. "These documents," she declared, her voice sharp and triumphant, "prove our legal authority over all community water resources in this area." She pointed to stamps and signatures like she was presenting a case before the Supreme Court. I leaned closer, asked politely to read them. But every time I tried, she shifted the angle, letting me glimpse a county seal here, a signature there while blocking the rest. From a distance, it looked convincing. Up close, it felt like smoke and mirrors. "You're illegally using community property every time you touch that water," she snapped. One of her neighbors nodded like a bobblehead, though his eyes kept sliding toward the lake with something like doubt. The other woman shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet my gaze. That told me more than Paula's theatrics ever could. Not everyone was convinced. Later that day, Officer Bennett was back again. Paula had called in another complaint, this time accusing me of continued willful trespassing. She unloaded her whole rehearsed speech, dramatic gestures, legal jargon, the works. But this time, I fought back with a detail she wasn't expecting. "I'm paying separate property taxes for this land every year," I told the officer, "including what the county calls lake surface assessments." That got his attention. He stopped writing mid-note, eyebrows rising as he looked from me to Paula. For the first time, I saw her composure falter, just for a second, like she hadn't expected me to know that detail, let alone mention it. She recovered fast, launching into more legal-sounding nonsense about how property taxes don't override HOA bylaws. But something had shifted. The officer closed his notepad with finality. "Ma'am, I'm not seeing any clear criminal violation here. If you believe you have valid legal claims, you'll need to pursue them through civil channels." Civil channels, not police, not sirens, not handcuffs, just paperwork and patience. Paula's face went crimson. She gathered her documents with angry jerks of her hands and hissed that she'd be posting official notices throughout the neighborhood. A threat thinly veiled. When the porch finally cleared, I walked down to my dock again. The sun danced across the water, golden ripples twisting around the buoys I'd placed like quiet guardians. But it didn't feel peaceful anymore. The lake, the one my grandfather had left me, the one I'd dreamed about for years, now felt like a battlefield. That night the notifications started. A neighborhood group text, somehow with my number included. I hadn't signed up for anything, hadn't consented to join, but there I was, scrolling through a storm of messages. Paula had posted her 48-hour notice, accusing me of violating community rules and calling for appropriate pressure to resolve the situation. Her words were careful, but the meaning was clear. She wanted neighbors to turn against me. The responses rolled in fast. Some confused, some hostile, a few outright threatening. I didn't even know half of these people. But now my name, my address, my supposed selfishness was plastered across their screens like a public enemy notice. And then came the flyers. Thursday morning, taped to every streetlight within 6 blocks. Urgent community notice, unauthorized lake usage by new resident. My photo, printed grainy and harsh, snapped while I stood on my own dock. Underneath, in bold red letters, boundary violations, community theft. The first time I saw it, I laughed, the absurdity of it all. But as I kept walking, block after block, seeing my face staring back at me from poles and stop signs, the humor drained away. Paula had crossed into something darker now. By noon, my inbox was flooded with anonymous emails, official-sounding complaints, citations of county codes I'd never heard of, long paragraphs written to sound like law, each one accusing me of stealing community resources. It was systematic, strategic, like she'd studied intimidation and bureaucracy until she could wield them like weapons. Friday, she staged a full-blown protest. I watched from my kitchen window as Paula gathered a dozen neighbors at my dock, signs in hand. Community water access. Fair fees for all. They posed in a semicircle, snapping photos like it was a campaign rally. Half the faces looked proud, holding their signs high, rallying behind her. But the others, they shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward my house. They didn't look convinced, they looked trapped. And in that moment, I realized Paula wasn't just fighting me. She was performing for them, for power, for control. That evening, I got a call from the county clerk's office. A tired voice on the other end asked me to confirm my property taxes were up to date. "We get these calls when neighbors don't understand property lines," he said with a sigh. He sounded almost bored, like Paula's complaints weren't even new. That gave me hope, but also dread. Because if her noise had reached county officials already, what else was she capable of? Saturday morning, I found surveyor's flags planted in my backyard. Bright orange, stuck into the dirt at odd angles, marking fake boundaries that cut across my property like scars. Someone had been in my yard at night, close enough to touch my windows. And I knew, without a shadow of doubt, Paula wasn't going to stop. How far would you go to make someone break? Because by Sunday morning, I was starting to feel like Paula's campaign wasn't about rules anymore, it was about control. About pushing me until I snapped. That knock on my door was Paula this time. It was a stranger, a woman in her 40s holding a water bottle like it was a peace offering. She introduced herself softly, Sophie Clark. I live 3 blocks over. Her eyes darted around nervously, like she was afraid Paula had planted cameras in the trees. She didn't waste time. I wanted to apologize for everything that's been happening. Honestly, something doesn't feel right about the way Paula's handling this. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Someone else admitted it, this wasn't normal. Sophie didn't stay long, just long enough to leave the water bottle in my hands. Later, when I went to throw it away, I found a slip of paper folded inside. A phone number. A message scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Text me. Something's not right about HOA finances." I stared at that note for a long time, my heart thudding in my chest. That night, I sat surrounded by flyers I'd pulled down, emails I'd saved, screenshots of group messages dripping with Paula's venom. My desk looked like a crime board. And maybe, in a way, it was, because this wasn't just neighbor drama anymore. This was war. Monday morning, Paula escalated again, this time with a live broadcast. She set up right in front of my house, lights, microphone, multiple cameras. Her HOA board stood behind her like loyal soldiers, and there I was, trapped inside my own living room, watching her turn my home into a backdrop for her performance. Her speech was polished, rehearsed, dripping with all the right words. Community, fairness, protecting shared resources. She gestured toward my house as if it was Exhibit A in a trial. One selfish man versus an entire neighborhood. She was good, too good. I could see why people believed her. But then she slipped, just for a moment. Talking about the lake's maintenance budget, she said, "I personally approve all spending for this lake." Then caught herself. Changed it to, "The board collectively approves spending." It was quick, most people missed it, but I didn't. In that slip her mask cracked. I replayed it on my phone again and again. "I personally approve all spending. Not the board, not a collective, just Paula." And suddenly, Sophie's note burned brighter in my mind. Something's not right about HOA finances. That night, I filmed my own response. Nothing flashy. Just me, standing on my dock, the lake behind me. "I'm not sure why paying property taxes on land I inherited has become controversial," I said, calm, simple, factual. "But I'm happy to talk with neighbors honestly about property boundaries, instead of staging demonstrations in front of people's homes." I posted it online, and the response shocked me. Within hours, comments started rolling in. Why would someone pay taxes on land they don't own? Has anyone actually seen the HOA paperwork? Something doesn't add up here. For the first time, the tide shifted, not fully in my favor, but enough that cracks appeared in Paula's armor. The next day, I got a text from that number Sophie had slipped me. 4 words, check your email, urgent. What I found made my stomach drop. Photos of Paula's personal calendar, meetings that never happened, maintenance hours logged when no one had been at the lake, emergency sessions that neighbors later confirmed they'd never been told about. And then the most damning, expense approvals that didn't match anything we'd actually seen at the lake. Thousands of dollars gone, no repairs, no upgrades, nothing but numbers scribbled in her private records. It was either chaos or fraud. Wednesday, Paula went door to door. Clipboards in hand, rehearsed speeches spilling out at every porch. I watched from my window as some neighbors nodded along, letting her talk for 20 minutes straight. But others, they cut her off, closed the door, shook their heads. Her control wasn't absolute anymore. The cracks were spreading. By Thursday, the stakes escalated again. Paula announced a public showdown at the annual water festival. She called it a boundary map examination. She promised to bring an HOA lawyer. She demanded I bring all property documents. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a trap. A public trial, staged at a community event where families came for food and games. And yet, part of me wanted it. Because if this fight was going to end, maybe it needed to happen in front of everyone. Maybe the truth needed witnesses. Friday night, Sophie came by again. She looked pale, nervous, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. I was, not really. But I also knew one thing. If I backed down now, Paula would win. Not just against me, but against anyone who dared to question her again. And as I watched the lake glow under the setting sun, my heart pounding, one thought drowned out the rest. Saturday would decide everything. What happens when a community celebration turns into a courtroom? That Saturday morning, I found out. The crisp autumn air should have carried the sounds of laughter, games, and kids running along the shoreline. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding like a drum as Sophie, and I walked to the pavilion carrying folders that suddenly felt too heavy for human hands. Families were setting up picnic tables, kids hanging balloons, music drifting faintly from a speaker. None of them knew they were about to watch a trial. None of them knew Paula had turned their annual water festival into her stage for execution. And there she was, waiting at the far end of the pavilion. Folding table, microphone, binders stacked in neat piles. She even had a portable speaker system, as if this wasn't a neighborhood gathering but a press conference. Her eyes locked on me like a predator spotting prey. When the crowd settled, she began, calm, confident, every word a performance. She talked about shared resources, community values, and the threat of freeloaders. She pointed toward me, my dock, my buoys, like they were evidence of some crime against humanity. And the people listened, nodding, murmuring, buying every carefully crafted line. Then came my turn. Sophie and I stepped up with our evidence, screenshots of Paula's calendar, emails that didn't match real events, financial discrepancies that screamed fraud. For 20 minutes we held the room. People leaned in, brows furrowed, whispers spreading. For the first time, truth felt louder than Paula's theater. But then, I made a mistake. I projected one of the photos Sophie had sent me, Paula's calendar, meetings that never happened, maintenance logs that were lies. It was damning, until I realized too late that I hadn't blurred out the background, private family details, personal appointments. Paula pounced. "This man has been stalking me," she shouted, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "He broke into my private life, took photos of my home, of my family's schedule. Is this the kind of neighbor you want?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. heads swiveled toward me, eyes filled with suspicion. The sympathy I'd felt moments earlier evaporated like mist on the water. I tried to explain, tried to tell them Sophie had provided the photos, that I'd only used them to show discrepancies. But my words sounded weak, defensive, hollow. Paula clutched the papers to her chest, her voice cracking just enough to sound vulnerable. He'll say anything to avoid paying his fair share, even invade my privacy, even put my family at risk. And the crowd believed her. I could feel the tide turning in real time. Neighbors who had been murmuring doubts now shook their heads at me. A woman near the front whispered, "That's disgusting." A man muttered, "Untrustworthy." Then Paula unveiled her final weapon, a thick binder of expense reports. Line by line, she walked the crowd through payments, landscaping companies, maintenance contractors, legal consultants. Every dollar accounted for, every signature in place. It looked official. It looked legitimate. Even Sophie wavered, her confidence cracking as she flipped through the pages. "It looks real," she whispered. The questions started, pointed not at Paula but at me. Why would you use illegally obtained photos? How can we trust your accusations now? Maybe you're just trying to get out of paying fees. It felt like the ground opened beneath my feet. For 10 excruciating seconds, silence hung over the pavilion. 10 seconds where I could feel every stare like a dagger. 10 seconds where my reputation crumbled in front of people I barely knew. And then applause, scattered at first, then louder, for Paula. The sound was like nails in a coffin. I'd lost, not just the argument, not just the evidence, but something bigger, my standing, my credibility, my chance at peace in this neighborhood. The festival carried on, but it felt hollow. Parents kept their kids close when I walked by. Conversations stopped when I approached. Sophie looked devastated, apologizing over and over. "I should have checked the photos," she whispered. But I knew the blame was mine. I hadn't protected her, hadn't protected myself. That night I sat in silence, staring at my phone. Drafted a message to Paula, an apology, a surrender. My finger hovered over send. But I didn't send it. Because somewhere in the pit of my stomach, a quiet truth burned through the shame. If I gave up now, she'd win. Not just against me, but against everyone she'd silence with intimidation. And I couldn't let that happen. How do you come back after losing everything? That was the question echoing in my head Sunday morning as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at cold coffee that tasted like defeat. My credibility was gone. My neighbors thought I was the villain. Paula had paraded her victory in front of everyone, and I had let her. For the first time, I wondered if it would be easier to sell the house, to walk away, to leave the lake to her and her army of clipboards. But then Sophie called. Her voice was steadier than I expected. "If you give up now," she said, "she'll do this to someone else next year. It won't stop with you." Her words hit me like a slap. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every neighbor Paula had intimidated, every family she had squeezed with fees, every person who didn't have the energy to fight back. If I backed down, I'd be handing her permission to keep ruling through fear. That's when something inside me hardened. I stopped thinking like a victim, and I started thinking like a strategist. Paula wanted to play theater. Fine, I'd give her theater. Monday afternoon, I left bait. A simple sheet of paper on my porch table, carefully angled so anyone snooping would see it. It looked like an old survey report, vague enough to seem important, with a tiny dot in the corner only visible up close. That dot was the trap. If Paula confronted me about it, I'd know she had been snooping around my property, watching me, reading things she had no right to. It worked faster than I expected. By evening, she stormed up to my door, waving her phone. "Forgery," she shouted. "This is fraudulent documentation, and I'll have the police here again if you don't stop." She had just told me everything I needed to know, because the only way she could have known about that dot was by being close enough to read the fake document. She'd been watching my porch, watching me. Her obsession was no longer speculation. It was proof. The next day, she escalated again, announcing a final boundary map examination with an HOA lawyer present. The wording was dramatic, the timing designed to intimidate. But to me, it felt like opportunity, because either she had real legal backing or she was bluffing, and if it was the latter, the cracks in her facade would finally split wide open. By Wednesday, a man showed up at my door with a folder that looked official enough to scare anyone who didn't know better. A gag order, Paula called it, demanding I stop spreading false information about HOA finances. The paper was covered in legalese, printed on impressive letterhead, but it lacked court stamps. No filing number, no judge's signature. It wasn't a real order, just another scare tactic, theater. I refused to sign it, calmly explaining that I'd rather resolve this in the public meeting she herself had called. Her mask slipped then, just for a heartbeat. "You're making this harder than it has to be," she snapped, the calm community leader act replaced by raw frustration. "Just pay your fees and stop causing problems." And in that moment, I saw it, the desperation behind the performance. She wasn't as untouchable as she pretended to be. That night, I started preparing like it was a mission. If she wanted a public showdown, I would bring proof, real proof. I borrowed a portable projector, tested it again and again in my living room, making sure maps would be visible from every angle. I marked my buoys on survey overlays, synced the images with county records. I even used a drone to capture footage of the lake boundaries from above, so no one could argue with what the eye could see. Every detail mattered, because one glitch, one stumble, and Paula would spin it into another humiliation. By Thursday, the plan was set. Sophie would sit in the middle of the crowd, blending in. Her role was simple but crucial. When the time came, she would reveal her own evidence about the HOA's finances. Not hearsay, not rumor, real numbers she had tracked herself. Friday evening, I confirmed the meeting details. Saturday morning, the entire community would gather again. Paula's stage, Paula's lawyer, Paula's army. But this time, I wouldn't be walking in as prey. This time, I was walking in with the truth, and the tools to make it undeniable. And as I stood on my dock that night, the moonlight shimmering on the water, one thought steadied me. If Paula wanted a war, she had finally chosen the battlefield where I could win. What does justice sound like? Sometimes, it sounds like silence. The kind of silence that falls over a room when the truth becomes undeniable. Saturday morning was gray, the sky heavy with clouds that felt like they knew something big was coming. The community center buzzed with energy, neighbors filing in with lawn chairs, whispers, and nervous smiles. For them, it was curiosity. For me, it was Judgment Day. Paula had turned the meeting into a spectacle. She stood at the front of the room, confident as ever, flanked by binders stacked like fortresses. A large easel, a pointer, even her lawyer in a pressed suit carrying a briefcase. It looked more like a courtroom than a community gathering. Her body language radiated victory. I set up quietly in the back, my projector, my laptop, the drone footage cued and ready, every wire tested 3 times. Sophie slipped into the crowd, blending in, her folder of documents hidden under her jacket. We had one shot. The lawyer began, laying out a textbook explanation of HOA authority, bylaws, property responsibilities. His voice was calm, professional. And for 15 minutes, the crowd nodded along, his words giving weight to Paula's story. I could feel it happening all over again, the tide leaning her way, the neighbors convinced. Then it was my turn. I dimmed the lights and turned on the projector. On the wall, the official county survey map lit up. With one click, I overlaid my property boundaries. And then, through the windows, perfectly aligned, everyone could see the orange buoys bobbing in the water. The boundary lines matched. Exactly. A hush fell. People craned their necks toward the lake outside, then back to the glowing map. It wasn't just words anymore. It wasn't accusations. It was visual proof. Then I launched the drone footage. From above, the entire lake spread out like a canvas. The aerial overlays showed every property line, every marker, every inch of the water. And there it was, in crisp, undeniable clarity. The lake was mine. My grandfather's deed had been right all along. The silence was deafening. Murmurs started, confused, shocked. "He owns the lake," someone whispered. Another muttered, "Why did Paula say otherwise?" For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the shift. The room wasn't leaning toward Paula anymore. It was leaning toward the truth. And then Sophie stood. Her voice was clear, steady. "I need to say something about the HOA finances." Paula froze. Sophie opened her folder and spread the documents across a table. Neatly typed spreadsheets, receipts, handwritten notes she had collected over 2 years. Paula has been collecting fees from 8 families. Over $25,000 total, but not one contractor has been paid. Not one maintenance project completed. The money is gone. The words hit like an explosion. Neighbors gasped, voices rose. "Where is our money?" shouted one man. "What did you do with it?" demanded another. Paula tried to keep control. Her face pinched, her voice sharp. "Those numbers are wrong. You don't understand how complicated this is." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. They'd seen the maps. They'd seen the buoys. Now they were staring at financial records that told a story of fraud. Even the lawyer seemed rattled. His voice faltered, his confidence slipping. When someone asked him directly if non-HOA members could be forced to pay fees for property they legally owned, he closed his briefcase and walked out. That silence, that was justice. The neighbors erupted, not in applause this time, but in anger, demands for accountability, shouts for refunds. Faces that had once looked at me with suspicion now turned on Paula, eyes blazing. She tried one last defense, her voice shaking with fury. "You don't know how hard I've worked to protect this community. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made." But the mask was gone, and for the first time, everyone saw her not as a leader, but as a fraud. By the end of the meeting, she was cornered. The county attorney had been called in. Legal papers were drafted right there in the community center. Paula was ordered to return every misappropriated dollar, pay legal fees, and relinquish all claims to HOA authority. Her hand shook as she signed. The pen scraped across the paper, the sound of defeat echoing louder than any of her speeches ever had. And as I watched her signature dry, I realized something. This wasn't just my victory, it was the community, because finally the truth had drowned out the lie. What does humiliation look like when the mask finally shatters? In Paula's case, it looked like her sitting at a plastic table in the middle of the community center, pen in hand, signing away everything she thought she controlled. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of the meeting, legal documents were finalized. She was ordered to return every dollar she had siphoned from her neighbors, over $25,000 in so-called lake fees. She had to reimburse legal costs for the investigation. She was banned for 5 years from serving on any HOA or community board in the county. And perhaps worst of all, she was referred to the tax authority for possible charges of unreported income. The woman who once called the cops on me for standing on my own dock was now facing investigations far bigger than a neighborhood squabble. And it didn't stop there. The community insisted she personally remove every sign, every fence, every fake HOA rules post she'd hammered into the ground around the lake. I'll never forget watching her on that Saturday afternoon, sweat dripping down her forehead as she unscrewed her own authorized personnel-only signs. Each one came down under the eyes of neighbors who had once clapped for her speeches. Every clang of metal against the truck bed was like a bell tolling for her empire. But the humiliation reached its peak with one requirement. She had to record a public apology video. The same woman who had mastered staged speeches and community theatrics now sat stiffly in front of a camera, reading lines crafted by her legal counsel. She admitted she had lied about property boundaries. She admitted she had fabricated HOA authority. She admitted she had mishandled funds. The words stumbled out of her mouth like broken glass. The video played on a loop at the community center for a week, shared in the same neighborhood chat where she'd once spread lies about me. Her voice, once so commanding, was now flat, lifeless. It was the sound of someone stripped bare. For me, the sweetest moment wasn't revenge. It was the shift I saw in my neighbors' eyes. People who had once avoided me at the grocery store now stopped to talk. Parents who once pulled their kids away when I walked by now waved. Trust was being rebuilt, not through speeches, not through pressure, but through truth. And something remarkable happened. Out of the ashes of Paula's fake authority, the community created something real. Instead of mandatory fees, neighbors voted to start a voluntary community fund. No one person in charge, no one voice louder than the rest. Decisions made collectively, financial reports available to anyone who asked. Every dollar tracked, every expense transparent. The system was simple but powerful. Monthly meetings, rotating representatives, and rules designed to prevent another Paula from ever rising again. No secrecy, no intimidation, just cooperation. And people contributed willingly. More money flowed into the voluntary fund than Paula had ever squeezed out of people through fear. Because when people trust the system, they don't mind helping. Dock repairs, new safety equipment, environmental protections, all funded openly, with receipts and signatures. The lake that had once been a stage for conflict became a place of healing. One afternoon, I stood at the shoreline and watched kids splashing freely in the water. Parents laughed, grilling burgers nearby. My orange buoys bobbed gently in the sun, not as a line of division but as a marker of safety. The old sign Paula had planted, HOA Lake Fees Required, was gone. In its place stood a new wooden marker carved by hand. It read simply, Neighbors Lake, open to all, respect the water. That one sentence carried more authority than all of Paula's binders and speeches combined. And maybe the most satisfying sight of all was Paula herself, walking slowly down the dock to dismantle the last of her fake HOA rules boards. She didn't look at anyone, didn't speak, just worked silently, the queen of paperwork now reduced to a laborer tearing down her own false kingdom. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just strips a person of the power they never deserved. And as the last sign came down, I realized something important. This wasn't about beating Paula. It was about freeing everyone she'd managed to control. What does peace feel like after a storm? For me, it was standing on my dock weeks later, the lake calm, the air quiet, and knowing I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. At first, I had no idea what I truly owned. I thought I was just moving back to my grandfather's old place, reclaiming memories of childhood fishing trips and quiet mornings on the water. I didn't realize that deed in the basement meant more than land. It meant the lake itself. It meant responsibility. It meant that when Paula tried to twist the truth, I had the evidence to hold the line. And yet, for months, I let her make me doubt myself. I let her turn my neighbors against me. I let her paint me as the villain of a story where I'd done nothing wrong. That's the real danger of manipulation. It doesn't have to be true to feel real. All it takes is one loud, confident voice and a crowd too tired, too polite, or too trusting to question it. Paula almost won. She almost stole the lake. She almost stole our money. She almost stole our sense of community. But she didn't. Because eventually, the truth pushed back. Now the lake is different. Not in the way it looks, but in the way it feels. There's no fear when people walk by the shore. No tension when kids run down the dock. The water isn't a weapon anymore. It's just water, open, free, and shared. The voluntary fund works better than any of us expected. People donate because they want to, not because they're scared into it. Families take pride in knowing their dollars fixed a dock board or bought new safety ropes. Meetings are real discussions, not staged performances. The power isn't in one person's hands anymore, it's in everyone's. And the money Paula stole, returned. Some families took their refunds. Others donated them straight back into the fund, turning deception into restoration. In the end, we had more resources for improvements than Paula had ever collected under her so-called authority. The lake has new life now. New kayaks glide across its surface. Kids laugh as they race along the shore. Families gather for cookouts where no one talks about fees or fines. Even the county recognized the new agreement, stamping it into property records so no future Paula could rise up and claim control again. But the real transformation wasn't in the lake, it was in us. The same neighbors who once glared at me now wave when I pass. The same people who once whispered in group texts now stop to ask how they can help. The fear Paula sowed has been replaced by something stronger: trust, not blind trust, earned trust. Sometimes I stand by the water at dusk, watching the ripples fade into the horizon, and I think about my grandfather. The meticulous records he kept, the taxes he paid year after year, the quiet way he cared for this place without ever demanding credit. He knew what this lake meant. He knew it wasn't just property, it was a legacy. And maybe that's why I couldn't back down. Maybe that's why, even when I wanted to quit, something inside me refused. Because dignity doesn't always look like pride. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it looks like standing on your dock while the world calls you selfish and holding your ground anyway. Paula wanted control. She wanted obedience. She wanted to bend the truth until it snapped in her favor, and for a while she almost did. But in the end, the lake pushed back. Now when I see that new wooden sign, Neighbors Lake, open to all, respect the water, I realize it's more than just a rule. It's a promise. A reminder that community is strongest when no one person owns it, when no one voice drowns out the rest. So if you've ever faced someone trying to bully you with fake authority, remember this: their power only lasts as long as people believe the performance. The moment someone stubborn enough asks the right questions, the mask starts to crack. The truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs someone willing to stand long enough, steady enough to let it rise. And if someone ever tells you what you can or can't do on your own dock, check the deed. And bring receipts. Because sometimes the strongest victories aren't loud. They're quiet. They're written in water. They're carved in wood. They're felt in the peace of knowing you stood your ground, and the community stood with you in the end. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.